Charlotte Perkins Gilman was born in Hartford, Connecticut, July 3, 1860. She was a well-known young writer and social activist. When she was young, her father abandoned the family, leaving her and her mother and her other sibling alone by themselves. Gilman and her family moved around a lot as a child, which made her education suffer. When she got married, she married Charles Stetson in 1884. They had a daughter together whose name was Catherine. Catherine shows up a lot in reference to some of Gilman's works, as she was a lot of motivation within her life because she wanted to have a good relationship with her but not have the emotional contact of her and her father. They were married for over a decade, but when she got hit with a larger bout of depression, they got divorced as Gilman decided that she wanted to live by herself and thought that it was better for women to have more freedom. As she was married, she suffered severe depressions and was given treatment. These treatments are what to have been believed to influence the yellow wallpaper, as the suggestion was to rest without anyone interfering, or a rest cure. During her lifetime, Gilman discovered she had also had breast cancer and decided to move so she could see her family because she had moved away to write by herself. But unfortunately, at the end of her life, Gilman decided to end her life in 1932 using chloroform because she would rather die to herself, suicide, rather than to cancer. Charlotte Perkins Gilman is actually known for writing more than just the yellow wallpaper, but yellow wallpaper is her most important or famous work. This can be seen through her other novels, such as Herland, Women in Economics, In This Our World, The Man-Made World, When I Was a Witch, The Giant Wisteria, Something to Vote For, and more. Some of the more popular ones that she's written is usually a call-out towards the economic parts of the society, or more on the reformation of what women should be able to do, as within her time period there was a lot of more revolutionary stuff coming forward, and she wanted people to be able to experience wonderful things, and especially women, which are what the majority of her works are about, is about the things that could be improved and why things that have been wrong, and a lot of personal experience that people need to hear about. The yellow wallpaper was written in a combination of the 1880s and the 1890s. It was first published in 1892, but considering the writing period in Charlotte Perkins Gilman, it was probably that she's been working on this for a long time, and the majority of the work perhaps being in the 1880s. The 19th century was a period of a lot of social change, such as slavery was abolished, the Industrial Revolution, mass urbanization of the country. Notably, the Victorian era, which is this present era, is where the expression of her writing comes into play. This is the era where medicine was given either freely or highly judged by doctors based off of your female. The hysteria that a woman may face, as in a lot of medical issues in that era, were considered women being in hysterics, which could be punished by medical death, essentially. This can be shown a lot through, in at least the yellow wallpaper, because while it couldn't be technically termed as medical practical death by social isolation, driving somebody to insanity by allowing no social interaction and not allowed to read or write is very draining on the mental state, considering the lack of her stimulus and the repression of her ability to even exist at all due to what the doctor says. When the yellow wallpaper was first published, the entirety of the readers in its newspaper article, the people who read the article, believed it as almost unprintable due to the stuff that's inside the novel. This is the content, as it is a woman who is spiraling down into insanity due to lack of stimulation and time in her thoughts. The natural nature of the story scared the readers, which I believe was what Gilman wanted to have happen, as it was a call-out to worse times in the society. The yellow wallpaper deals with unequal marriage, which shows a woman who is picked apart by her own failing mental health. She wants to express herself. Due to her restrictions, she's no longer allowed to express herself, which slowly drives her insane. The implication behind the story is that it was written based off of Gilman's personal experience with the rest cure, which is the the medication that the doctor prescribed her when she went in due to her depression. This is knowing that it is at least very, very likely that Gilman experienced some, or if not all, of these things that she wrote into her story, which just pulls into perspective why there's so much detail in the yellow wallpaper, and why even small things like how the shifting of the wallpaper seems to draw more attention to it, and making you feel like something is there and that this is what she's actually seeing, bringing this mental insanity to a T. And it makes you feel sad for Gilman, because you wonder if this is truly how she lived her whole life after the miracle cure of the rest cure.
Here's the synopsis of the yellow wallpaper. The unnamed narrator and her husband go to a country estate where they stay the summer. The narrator suffers from nervous depression after giving birth to her child. Her husband, John, is her doctor. The treatment for her depression is to do no activity, and she feels trapped. She's not even allowed to write. The narrator journals to relieve her mind, even though her treatment says not to. She writes in her journal about the house she is staying in and seems to enjoy it. However, she mentions bars on the windows and rings on the walls. The yellow wallpaper in her room stands out the most to her. She's disturbed by its strange, formless pattern. She observes it a lot. As the summer continues, she continues to write and avoid from expressing her feelings to her husband. She still feels her husband is controlling her, and he disapproves of her wandering imagination. Synopsis continued. The narrator is fixated on the wallpaper in her room, and her husband refuses to cover it to avoid neurotic worries. She begins to imagine things, and her husband strongly disapproves. For example, she claims she sees people walking down the street. As she continues to think, she describes how she sees the bedroom. The room was previously a child's nursery. John's sister, Jenny, comes in and takes the narrator's mind off of the journaling. However, her husband threatens to send her to a real physician because she is not getting any better, because she's so tied up with the wallpaper. As the narrator spends more time alone, her fascination with the wallpaper grows even more. She tries to convince her husband she is doing well so she can be free. As she spends more and more time looking at the wallpaper, she thinks she sees a woman trying to escape the wallpaper. It drives her crazy, and she begins to rip the wallpaper off the wall to set the woman free. She then feels she is the woman creeping on the walls. So after she tears down all the wallpaper, her husband then enters the room and faints as to what he sees she's done to the room. The narrator is left creeping around the walls.
The narrator of the story is a young woman who is a mother and a newlywed and also struggles from depression. She is a very imaginative woman who believes that her house is haunted. Her husband tells her that she is forbidden from expressing her imagination, which is a hard thing to prevent someone from doing, and she starts fixating on the house, the wallpaper in particular. She then starts writing in a diary as a relief to her mind. By writing in this journal, she is hiding her thoughts to the world, causing her to fall into one of her make-believe worlds. She then starts to see a woman in the walls, which is herself, but she refuses to see it as herself. At first, she can see the woman in the walls trying to escape, and instead of trying to help her, she decides she'd rather catch her and tie her up. But in the end, she finally realizes that the woman trapped in the wallpaper is in fact herself, and rips and tears all of the wallpaper off of the room, freeing herself from being trapped inside the wallpaper. In the end, the narrator's depression and excessive imagination overall caused her to go insane. John is the narrator's husband and also her doctor. He is married to a woman that he believes he knows very well, but he only knows her on the outside and not what is on the inside. He does not know of the woman that is struggling, trying to escape. John does not want his wife to be imagining all of the things she does, so he forbids her from it. He thinks that he knows what is best for his wife, without even finding out from her what is really wrong. John's form of treatment ends up going very bad. Instead of expressing herself, she is now forced to hide her true feelings from the world. John's intentions were not to make his wife worse, but by doing what he did, ultimately destroyed her once and for all. Not only did he destroy her, but he destroyed his relationship, causing his own wife to not even recognize him when she goes insane. Jenny is John's sister. She is like a housekeeper for them. Although Jenny is not in the story for long, she is used more as the role model for what the narrator is supposed to be doing, but is incapable of doing so. Jenny is supposed to act as the perfect domesticated woman, where the narrator is almost the complete opposite. Unlike John, Jenny can tell there is something more sinister going on with the narrator. The narrator notices that Jenny is becoming aware of her growing interest with the wallpaper in her room. Mary is the caretaker of John and the narrator's child. She is not in most of the story, but her importance is to symbolize the Virgin Mary and the perfect domesticated woman, just like Jenny.
So there are three main themes in the yellow wallpaper, and the first one is confinement. So the narrator faces both physical and mental confinement, and the physical confinement that she faces has to do with the environment that she's in and the room that she has to spend a lot of her time in. That room actually used to be a children's nursery, and so the wallpaper is super worn down, and she describes the lines as being crazy and without a definite pattern, and she also describes it as a prison, which doesn't sound very pleasant, and because it had children in it, there were bars on the window to keep them safe, but now that just makes it more isolating and lonely. And to add to that, her husband makes her stay there most of the time because he doesn't want her to work, because he thinks that if she works and if she overexerts herself, then it will make her mental condition worse. When in reality, she thinks that if she had something to do and she could continue her work, it would actually help her feel better because it would take her mind off how she's feeling. And then mental confinement, obviously she faces a lot of isolation and a lot of feelings of being alone and unheard. So while she is trying to get better, she's staying in the room alone and she's not having much contact with people. And so at the beginning, she just uses the wallpaper to kind of pass the time and to give her something to do. But as the story goes on, it kind of turns into an obsession. And it's really just out of desperation to have a connection to something and to be able to have an interaction, because she's not getting that from her family. And while her husband's intentions may be good, he's actually closing her off more because he's not giving her an opportunity to share how she feels and to talk about what she thinks would make her condition better. And so she's further confined because of that. So the second theme that Gilman touches on with this story is women's roles. At this time, women were not as respected, and they were seen as lesser than men. They were just expected to stay in the house and to submit to whatever the husbands told them to do. And so instead of being able to talk to John about how she really feels, she just has to follow the instructions that he gives her. And because he's a doctor, he assumes that he knows everything that's going on and he knows exactly how she's feeling, when really she hasn't really gotten the chance to explain everything that she's going through. But because she's a woman, she's just expected to follow what he tells her to do. And so she doesn't really feel safe opening up to him and telling him that she doesn't think that his opinion is right. So instead, she writes a lot to the reader about how she feels trapped and she feels dismissed and she feels like she can't speak her mind. And Gilman uses all of those feelings to characterize the room that she's in. And so the way that the wallpaper comes to life in her head is a very close reflection of how she's feeling and how trapped she feels. So in the story, she writes about how she sees the lines and the branches on the wallpaper as prison bars. But as the story goes on, she's able to make out a figure behind the bars, and she tells the reader that she knows that it's a woman. And by the end, she even says that she can see multiple women, and they're trying to break free. But every time they do, the lines of the paper entangle them and almost trap them and suck them back into the wall. Which that seems like a really disturbing image, but it's really reflective of women's roles at the time, because they weren't really allowed to be their own person. And so a lot of them did feel trapped like that. They felt like if they stepped out and tried to break free and be their own person, they wouldn't be able to escape the societal norms of being overshadowed by men and not being valued and not being able to be their own person with their own ideas. So I think the way that she uses that is really clever, because she shows that the women are stuck in the place that they've been stuck, and they don't feel like they can get out, and they don't feel like they can be their own person and make their own way, and they're trapped by the way that society has told them they should be. So the last and probably most obvious theme that Gilman uses is mental illness, because by the end of the story, Jane is basically completely crazy, mostly just because she's had to be isolated and alone, and she hasn't felt like she can talk to anyone about how she really feels. So I think Gilman uses this story as an opportunity to comment about how bad it can be if you treat mental illness poorly, and the bad effects that it can have on a person, because when someone's mind is that fragile, it's really important that their loved ones show them that they're valued, and that they're understood, and that they're loved, and that they can have a safe place where they can talk about how they feel, because otherwise they're just going to be pushed further into their isolation. So she uses John as an example of what can happen if someone doesn't give someone who's in a poor mental state the care and attention that they need. Because while John is telling her all of these things that he thinks will make her better, and he seems to care, he's not actually taking the time to give her the opportunity to show how she really feels and to tell him what she thinks would help her. Instead, he's really just giving her a solution from a medical standpoint and telling her that it's the only way that she should get better. When in reality, feelings don't really work that way, because it's different for every person. And so not having that outlet to share how she feels and talk about what she thinks could make her better just drives her further into isolation. And I really think if John had actually listened to his wife and allowed her to talk about how she feels and to get the care and attention that she really needed, then she could have healed a lot faster, and she may not have gone insane, because she wouldn't have been driven into isolation and wouldn't have felt like she couldn't talk to anyone and like she had to hide everything that she was doing from her loved ones.
The symbolism throughout the yellow wallpaper is the wallpaper itself. The narrator believes that the wallpaper is something that she must interpret. At first, the wallpaper is just unclean and has an uncertain pattern that she feels like she has to discover. But it is the pattern in the unspecific form that the narrator believes means something. As she's staring at it for hours, she begins to see it take form of a ghostly image hiding behind what she sees as bars of a cage. The wallpaper, to her, represents the family tradition and structure that she is stuck in. Key facts. The major tone throughout this entire story is the major anxiety. The conflict is that there is a conflict between the narrator and her husband about the treatment of her illness, and this leads to a struggle within her own mind because she is aware of the helplessness, but she doesn't want to be aware. The story is somewhat relevant right now. With everything going on, millions of Americans and people around the entire world feel trapped and confined within their own homes because of the lockdowns. And the mental strain that it causes is severely overwhelming to lots of people. Being confined in your own home and being allowed time in your own mind is really often a scary thing and can cause people to hallucinate.
Now for a video. In this scene done by 1893 Productions, we see the narrator locked in her room upstairs. She begins to tear the wallpaper down to free the woman that she sees behind the walls in her head. She destroys the room in the process. You see blood on the walls and parts of wallpaper being torn down. John then enters the room after he is warned by Jenny, and John immediately faints. The last scene is left with the narrator creeping around the walls.
I need you, now.
Open the door!
I can't. The key is on the front steps, John.
What's the matter? For God's sake, what are you doing?
On the front steps.
Go get the key.
Steps on the front steps. On the front steps. On the front steps. I've gotten out in spite of you and Jane. And I've pulled off most of the wallpaper so you can't put me back.
For the journal entry, we would like for you to write a paragraph response about how you would feel to a situation which we have described. The situation is, you're a woman who's about 26 years old, you've been married for years, and recently you've come across a stump or a stumble in your health. You haven't really been feeling well, and you don't feel like your partner cares for you or for your concerns with your medical health. When you go to the doctor and explain your worries, you tell him what's been going on and why you feel the way that you do. The doctor claims that you have a severe case of hysteria and that you need to be sent by yourself into isolation into one of the local institutions or by yourself for therapy. Put yourself into the narrator's shoes or even her daughter's shoes. How would you react?